Let's try this again. This is my third attempt. I'm out here in my yard on this beautiful sunny morning, and for some reason I keep losing my video. So I'm going to try this once again. Continuing on from Friday, sharing the gospel of the kingdom, introduction of an introduction to the gospel of the kingdom. And my intent is to not is to just open a window and show that there's much more to the gospel of the kingdom than we have been taught, and it's much more than accepting Jesus and going to heaven. It's much more compelling. It goes back to before the foundation of the world. In the first video, I talked about God's eternal purpose and how Jesus and John and Paul and even Peter discussed what was going on in eternity before the foundation of the world, and how I was trying to make the point that the gospel of the kingdom is central and was central, and God's eternal purpose was central to what was preached in the first century. So the first century gospel probably would sound a lot different than what we hear today in evangelical churches. And that's my point. I'm trying to open up people's eyes to see that there's much more to the story. And maybe I can point you to other greater details and other teachers in other books who are bringing out this gospel of the kingdom. And so the first message I shared, the first little video I shared, was about God's eternal purpose from before the foundation of the world. The second video was about creation and how Jesus was the creator and how he created according to God's eternal purpose. And now we're getting into the Old Testament. And so you see right after the creation story, you see where Cain kills Abel and he gets driven out of the garden, and he goes and builds a city in opposition to what God had asked him to do, because God had told his parents, Adam and Eve, go, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. So he goes and instead of filling the earth and being fruitful and multiply, he goes and builds a city, and it becomes a wicked city. And you see this trend and this drift away from God, and quickly, within a few generations, things become exceedingly wicked, to the point where God decides he's going to destroy the earth, destroy humanity, except for a faithful family in Noah. So Noah, he asked Noah to build an ark and build a huge ship, and then we know the story where there's a worldwide flood, and the animals come, and he preserves both humanity and many of the land animals over the flood, and they survive that horrible judgment. But then God promises he's not going to judge the earth. And then immediately within a few generations, you see the same trend and drift away from the Lord, away from faithfulness and away from God, to the point where God decides he has to do something again. And you see the beginning of many evil cities, particularly the story of Babel stands out, the Tower of Babel, where Nimrod decides that, hey, we're going to reach God. We're going to reach up and we're going to touch him, and we're going to make a name for ourselves, which is symbolizing human religion. Human religion is human beings reaching up and controlling and touching God. And that's what the story of the Tower of Babel represents. So God decides he's going to divide up. He has to break that up because he's not going to flood the earth again. So he goes down and he splits up their language. So they all speak different languages, which effectively divides them up into different nations. And they all separate and they begin warring almost immediately. And then there's a verse that says that God separated the nations according to the sons of God. And then there's many people believe that that's when certain spirits come to oversee and control different nation groups. And you begin to see multiple religions and worship of other gods. And out of that, God decides, I'm gonna take one of these nations for myself. and I'm going to build a nation out of Abraham. And so he goes to Abraham, who was a faithful man, and he asked him to count the stars in the sky and the sand of the seashore. And if he can count them, then he'll know how many descendants he will have, which was a big deal back then. So he promises Abraham a son by his wife Sarah, who I think neither Abraham nor Sarah believed that God would be able to do such a thing. And so they decided to go ahead and have a son by one of her servants. And that's the story of Haggai and Ishmael. And Ishmael is born, who becomes the father of the Arab people. And then 14 years later, God performs a miracle with Sarah, who's in her 90s, and they have their own son named Isaac. And so Isaac becomes a boy, and there's a story where God comes to him and it says, I want you to sacrifice your only son, Isaac. And I'm sure this was a horrible challenge to Abraham's faith. This good God that he worships, this God like no other God, the supreme God of all gods, is asking him to sacrifice this son who he promised he would give him. And Abraham obeys God, and he goes to sacrifice Isaac. And the story goes that he was actually dropping his knife down to kill his son on the altar, this altar that he had built, and an angel stops him. And so he tells him not to kill his son, and then he provides a ram, and they sacrifice the ram instead. But then God knows that Abraham is faithful and that he's willing to even give up his only son. And then that's God's test of Abraham, that he can send his only son through the line of Abraham. And then that's almost like a foretelling of the gospel of the kingdom. God's starting to tell the story. Thousands of years before things play out, he tells the story of giving his only son. Okay, Abraham, you're willing to give your son? Okay, then I'm going to give my only son through your only son and through your descendants. So God did not require the death of Isaac, but he did require the death of his own son to save humanity. And then we know the story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Israel, and the 12 sons of Israel come out of Jacob. And Jacob gets renamed Israel, and then he has the 12 sons. And then they get sent into captivity into Egypt. And Egypt becomes their place of enslavement for 400 years. God sends Moses, who is also a type of Christ, a future foretelling of Jesus Christ, in that he rescues his people out of bondage. In Egypt being symbolizing the world system that every human being is in right now, the fallen world system that enslaves us when we're outside of Christ. And so Moses rescues Israel, all the people of Israel. There's about 1 million of them now, because they'd been in Egypt for 400 years. And they come through the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is a symbolic of the baptism, water baptism. It's a symbolism of going through death and resurrection. And as they enter into, he calls them into Canaan, which was a fruitful land where Israel would be planted. Canaan is a type of Jesus Christ also, the land upon which they would live and prosper and gain life and gain new life. So it's almost like a resurrection story, coming out of Egypt, coming through the sea. And Paul mentions this in the book of Corinthians. He compares the story of Jesus Christ, the story of Christianity, to the story of Israel coming out of Egypt through the sea, baptized in the water of the Red Sea. And Egypt didn't survive the sea, but Israel did, miraculously. And then you have the formation of Israel, and you have David, who stands out as one of the chief kings. But before that, the government type of Israel was not a kingdom. He wanted things to be ruled by judges, and God himself wanted to be the king of Israel, but they rejected him. They wanted a human leader. They demanded a great king like the other nations. So you see this idolatry in Israel, how they wanted to be like the other nations who had kings, and above the kings there were these spiritual powers and principalities. They were evil, and you see stories of gods all throughout the earth. In every part of the earth, they all have these gods that they worshipped, and they are real spiritual beings. They're real, but under them was always a kingdom, and always human government, and cities, and concentrations of power, and warfare. So you see common themes in the nations outside of Israel. Israel was to be unique. They were to show what it's like when God's in charge. But they rejected God as their king. And through Samuel, God said, okay, they are rejecting me, Samuel, let's give him a king. So they gave him King Saul, who was desperately wicked. But then God, in his mercy, decides he's going to... I got a low battery. He decides he's going to show Israel what it's like to have a godly king. And not that David was always godly, but he became a type of Christ because he was a man after God's own heart. He, in his humanness and in his frailty, he sought after God hard, and he had God's house as top priority. He saw the decay, and the whole concept of Zion and the Mountain Zion and the tabernacle. There's the religious side of things in the temple, which God had designed, but it had become worldly and godless. So David, on Mount Zion, created a tabernacle, and that's where you see the Psalms come out. The divinely inspired prayers of Jesus come out of David. And he was a man after God's own heart. He sought God, and he had his failings, he had his sin, and he was a man of war. And his son Solomon became the peacetime king, godly king, who put wisdom at his top priority. And you have the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes come out of Solomon. And that was like the high point of Israel, the times of David and Solomon. And things, as you know, went downhill from there, and there were many backslidings, and there were many prophets sent for judgment. And you can see a lot of that, obviously, written in the Old Testament, the great history of all that. And then, so to reiterate, Israel was to show the world, and they were to be a blessing to the world, and they were to show the world what it's like when God's in charge, as opposed to the rest of the world and all the nations. They were what it's like when Satan's in charge, and Satan's minions and the principalities and powers are over the world system, and we're over the world system. So, but Israel was pulled out of them to show what it's like when God's in charge, and it was to be a set-apart nation, a special nation, and also the nation through which the Messiah was to come, the coming king. And we see Isaiah foretelling the suffering Messiah who would come and suffer and die for humanity. And it's a wonderful story, and you see this repeating telling of the story of God sending His Son and suffering and death and resurrection over and over all throughout the Old Testament. It's told repeatedly. And there's obviously I'm just skimming over this. This is, like I said, this is the introduction of an introduction to the gospel of the kingdom. And it's to point to much more than the gospel of salvation, much more than I want to go to heaven when I die. God is telling the story of the gospel of the kingdom, of His eternal purpose, which is centered and focused on Jesus Christ over and over and again. And I'm getting long here, so I'll stop here. And so we're right up to the point of Jesus Christ, which is when things get really good. And so my next video, hopefully tomorrow, will be about Jesus and the ministry of Jesus and the death of Jesus and what He actually begun. And then the next video after that will be the story of the church, the ecclesia, which is the proper word, Greek word. Church is actually a poor translation, but there's huge implications between everything I've already said and shared and the church itself. So I'm going to end it here and have a happy Monday and get outside and get some of this sunshine. And if this has blessed you at all, please share. Let me know. And have a great day.